congratulations. You have officially made it to the end of the Beyond Me study. This does not necessarily mean that you are all of a sudden a selfless juggernaut, all right? But it does mean that you hopefully have moved closer in discipleship to the Lord, and you are beginning to truly engage with the world around you as well. Every athlete loves reliving the glory days, okay? In fact, if you talk to anyone who played sports on any level, even if it was 8-year-old T-ball, all right, they can still remember something that happened on that field or on that court that truly was something that was memorable. Even I have a few glory days stories. Like back in the 9th grade, I scored 24 points one game my 9th grade year on the JV basketball team. That was a huge day. My junior year, I recovered a fumble one time, and I even got to start in football. I got to start 2 games, the last 2 games of my senior year. But you know, it's interesting. Looking back, my greatest accomplishments in athletics weren't actually the moments of glory. The biggest moment for me personally actually happened after our biggest loss. So I went to Lubbock Monterey High School, and Lubbock High School was one of our big rivals. But we always beat Lubbock High, so much so that Monterey had only lost to Lubbock High, I think, twice in like 40 years. I mean, we always beat Lubbock High School. But the area that I grew up in always had these massive headwinds that would show up, sometimes at the most inopportune time. So my senior year, we're playing against Lubbock High School, but there was a 45-mile-an-hour headwind that was coming against us. And so because of that, it was blowing in the direction of one of the end zones, and it meant that neither team could punt if they were going against the wind. Our punter tried one time, and it was like a negative 10-yard punt. I mean, it was crazy the way that this wind was blowing. It was the great equalizer for the two teams. Well, sure enough, for the 3rd time in 40 years, my senior year, we lost to Lubbock High School, 17-14. It was crazy. It was so brutal that after the game was over, the season had been a bit disappointing, and we had all these seniors that were quitting midway through the season and were not going to finish out because they were so disappointed in the way that the season had gone. I'll never forget, one of my friends came up to my locker, and we were so sad after the loss, and one of my friends came up to my locker and he said, "Are we quitting too?" I remember in that moment, I loved playing football. But even more than that, I truly was trying to live a life of discipleship. And I said to my friend, "I'm going home, but I'm coming back for practice on Monday." Sure enough, when I came back, there was a whole group of our senior class that had quit, but there was also a group that had decided to stay, but the team really kind of hung on the edge of a knife. Our coach, it was his first year that year to coach with us. And I'll never forget him stepping up in the film room, and he said, "Does anybody want to say anything?" He said, "Men, this was a really, really rough week for us. Is there anything that anybody would like to say?" And I don't know why. Maybe it was the voice of the Spirit. But I decided that I was going to stand up and say something. I stand up. I'm 17 years old. And I remember looking at the guys around, the seniors that were still in the room. And all of a sudden I start saying, "Hey, you guys remember when we went through 2-a-days together and we ran till we were sick? Do you remember the practices that we've done together since we were all in the 9th grade?" And then I start pointing at the guys. "Do you remember when you made this tackle? And do you remember when you ran the ball at this point? Do you remember?" And I'm just naming and calling all the guys out. And I said, "I'm not quitting. I'm here for the end. And I hope you guys will be as well." And I mean, it was like from the movie Rudy. All of a sudden, everybody started to cheer. And the coach walks up, knowing that the moment was special. And the coach walks up and says, "Now, men, I think we're ready to practice." Well, here's what's funny. It was just the high school kid standing up and speaking. And honestly, even looking back on it as an adult man today, it really was just kind of a weird moment that ended up being something kind of special. So not too long ago, I got invited to be the honorary head coach at my high school. And in that moment, a few of the coaches that were there that day are still at the school coaching to this day. One of the coaches came up and I said, "Hey, just out of curiosity," I said, "why did I get picked to be the honorary head coach?" I said, "I'm so excited. It's so kind that you would do this, but why did I get this invitation?" The coach looked and said, "Because you gave the 'Do you remember when' speech back when you were a senior in high school." I said, "What are you talking about? I mean, this is like 20 years later." I said, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "You don't realize it. But he said, we felt like we had lost the team. He said, in that moment, he said a bunch of the coaches could have lost their jobs if we had lost the team. He said, but you stood up, you gave the speech, and he said that set the tone so that we could move forward and have a better season the next year and then an even better season the year after. That team would end up going to the quarterfinals just 3 years after I graduated with that same coaching staff. It's bizarre. My biggest moment on the field of athletics was not a tackle, it was not a fumble, it wasn't even 24 points scored in a basketball game. My greatest athletic feat was when I was able to stand up in a moment of hardship and truly be a mouthpiece of cohesion amongst the team. When it comes to your walk with God, your great moments are going to be the ones when you stick with it, even when it seems like the goodness of God is being withheld for a time. You need to know it is not. But God's greatest miracles very rarely happen in a lightning bolt. God's greatest miracles typically unfold over time, and that moment of great hardship is what solidifies our moment of great faith. It's the reason Jesus understood this very powerfully. In John chapter 19, he's just been whipped with the cat o' nine tails 39 times, which, by the way, was such a brutal form of punishment. The cat o' nine tails wasn't just a whip. It was a whip that had 9 ends that came off the end of it, and they would have pieces of bone and glass and metal fashioned like fish hooks on the end. And when they would whip Jesus, or when they would whip a prisoner with the cat o' nine tails, they would whip, catch, and pull until the flesh was literally ripped from their bodies. It was not uncommon for someone being whipped with the cat o' nine tails to have the nose ripped right off their face or the ear ripped off the side of their head. He's been whipped until he's bloodied. He's been whipped until he is just in awful shape. He's been up all night, tried in secret by the Pharisees and Sadducees, and now he's brought before Pilate. And Pilate, knowing Jesus is an innocent man, has to try to intimidate him into crying uncle and recanting his faith in the Father. At that point, Pilate looks at him and says, Jesus, don't you realize I have the power to either crucify you or free you? It's in that moment Jesus has a stomach for hardship. It's in that moment that Jesus reminds Pilate of who he really is and of how powerful God really is. Jesus looks at Pilate and says, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from my Father. What Jesus has done in that moment is said, you have threatened me with crucifixion, but it is the very reason that I have come to this planet. It is the very reason that I have come for those that my Father and I love so very, very deeply. He says, do it. Do it. Put the 9-inch nails through my hands and feet. Do it. Slam that crown of thorns on top of my hand. Do it. String me up on that cross. Do it. Take my life. And I will be that sacrifice of atonement so that we can be reconciled to our favorite creation. Don't you see? Christ's stomach for hardship is the gold standard for the disciple. That we would come to a point that we would truly say, God, your will and not mine. God, your plan and not mine. God, I trust you in all things that you have fashioned me for this very moment, even when times are greatly difficult. Selflessness is putting Christ first and others second, even when it causes us great pain. Are you willing to suffer that people around you might know Jesus? You'd be shocked. This may end up being the defining moment of your entire life. The things that we are willing to suffer for are truly powerful in and through our lives. Nobody just suffers for no reason. If you are willing to suffer for the kingdom, that's when you'll truly have these life-defining moments. Thank you so much for taking part in this journey. And my prayer is that God would give you great testimonies that are worth being told all the way into eternity for the people that experienced God's love in and through your life, but also for those individuals who would come to faith in Christ, and eternity would be bigger because of your efforts.